Mr. Chairman, thanks to you for joining us today. I just want to echo what some of my colleagues have expressed, including my colleagues from Alaska, from Wyoming, and from Arizona. Over the past week or so, it has become apparent that certain federal agencies have, in a number of instances, acted rather intentionally to cause what I would consider undue hardship for the purpose of making a political point. For example, in Nevada, an elderly couple was kicked out of their home because their home was built on federal land. In North Carolina, National Park Service rangers forced the closure of a private business located along the Blue Ridge Parkway, even though the parkway itself remains open. Here in the Washington area, the National Park Service shut down the parking lot adjacent to Mount Vernon, which has been privately owned by a private foundation for 150 years, apparently because it couldn't shut down the privately owned Mount Vernon estate. It shut down the parking lot adjacent to Mount Vernon because, as I'm told, the parking lot is itself jointly owned by the National Park Service. No explanation was offered, of course, as to why this joint ownership even entitled, much less required, the National Park Service to shut it down. There's a great article on some of these things. I believe it ran on Sunday in the Washington Times. The headline reads, "National Park Rangers ordered to keep visitors out of privately run businesses." And I'll just read you the opening sentence of this. "The National Park Service has closed privately run marinas, restaurants, and inns throughout the country, and in some cases even posted guards to keep people from using them during the government shutdown, arguing that it doesn't have the money, manpower, or authority to let them operate." That begs the question, what exactly do they need to do to allow them to operate? Does it really take money to let a privately run business to operate? It seems to me quite the opposite. It seems to me that to allow a private business to operate doesn't cost the government money. But across the theme, across the country, similar themes are being echoed in many different ways where federal agencies are making this shutdown far more painful than it needs to be. Whatever the reason why this might be happening, it's wrong. Every branch of government needs to be working, and each entity needs to be working together with other entities to make sure that the negative impacts of a government shutdown are minimized rather than maximized and accentuated. Another aspect of this problem is that there are some states that are, by their very nature, far more susceptible to this kind of manipulation and this kind of intentional infliction of pain than other states. While most states have within them less than 10% of federal land, meaning while in most states less than 10% of the land is owned by the federal government, in 11 western states, including my own, the federal government owns more than 50% of the land. In my state, the state of Utah, the federal government owns roughly 70% of the land. And while some may praise the benefits of public land, it's clear that the federal government can and will use its immense power as a political tool. And I would add to this, public land becomes rather unlike public land when it is closed, when it's closed by people who just arbitrarily say, because of a shutdown, we're going to exclude you. It becomes government land at that point, and that's the point that they seem to be making. Now, imagine for a moment that a corporation or a single individual owned 70% of the land in a state like mine. That would certainly raise a lot of concerns by everyone who lives in that state, everyone who has any business with that state, even people outside that state. They'd be really concerned about the amount of influence that that individual or that corporation could exert over the lives of the citizens of that state. And so I have to ask the question, why shouldn't there be a similar concern when the owner is not an individual, is not a corporation, but is the federal government, a federal government which, by the way, declares itself exempt from all property taxation? The recent actions of federal land management agencies should give all of us plenty of reasons to examine the policies underlying such massive federal land holdings, which are concentrated in a relatively few number of states. The bottom line here is that federal land management agencies exert enormous influence over the country, an influence that's not often recognized by those outside the western United States. This influence is not just in the national parks. It's felt in many aspects of everyday life in states like mine. It's felt in how we fund our public schools, how we maintain our police and our fire services, and how we develop our infrastructure. And as we've seen over the past week, these agencies are willing and able to wield tremendous influence in a manner that serves the political ambitions of the few at the expense of the many. This raises a number of questions about the nature and extent of federally owned land, questions that we need to address here in Congress. I'd like to close just by pointing out this is not a partisan issue. I won't for a moment suggest that in the past or in the future this hasn't been or will not become a problem under a Republican administration. This is a bipartisan problem, and it's a problem that relates to the fact that the federal government owns too much land. And it owns way too much land in a few states like mine, and we've got to do something about it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank